Hello and welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, the founder of MoneyMagpie, and today I'm going to be speaking to my friend Nick Hubble, who is an investment writer, an economics writer for Southbank Investment. Before we do though, I have to tell you that it's time to follow us, subscribe, and comment on this because I'm very interested in your comments. I do read them, I do respond to them. So subscribe, and definitely comment before we do anything else. So I'm going to be talking to Nick Hubble, and Nick is actually living in Australia, but he has contacts in the UK, in Germany, and across the world. So, Nick, we need to talk about the world economy, just a small subject. Where are we at with the world economy? Is it as fragile as it seems right now?
Yeah, it's sort of one of those stories about hitting a man when he's down. So it's sort of tripping a man over when he's stumbling. We've got these all sorts of sort of general, gradual issues that are, a slow motion train wreck. And then we've got some short-term triggers like Trump's tariffs that are making things worse in the short run as well. So the stock market seems to be voting very much that we're in trouble. A lot of the stock markets around the world, actually, I think the Japanese one crashed 4% in a single day a few days ago, which was just extraordinary. A lot of this, well, actually, I should say there's so many things going on that everyone can blame their favorite ideological punching bag, right? You can blame tariffs, or you can blame demographics, or you can blame debt, or monetary policy, or whatever you like. There's enough news out there to pick and choose. But the biggest story, I think, right now is that for many decades, governments were able to fudge economic statistics by allowing large numbers of immigrants into the country and also by spending a lot more than they tax. So a good example of this is Australia because we didn't even have a recession in 2008, the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, because they allowed so many immigrants into the country and they spent so much money, borrowed and spent so much money that actually the economy didn't contract for two consecutive quarters, which is just extraordinary. And that showed the power of what happens if you allow immigration and spend lots of money. And governments all around the world adopted this, and that's how, they were able to mitigate a lot of the crises that we've seen. The problem is that immigration and too much government spending has other side effects, right? We're starting to see those play out in the political process now. People want less immigration. People are worried about sovereign debt crises like the Liz Truss story and the bond yields more recently. The French had a bit of a sovereign debt crisis as well. The Europeans obviously did after 2008. So all of a sudden people are saying, well, maybe we don't care so much about GDP growth and we care more about immigration and too much government spending and borrowing. So they're starting to shift and vote in elections for parties that say, look, we're not going to spend as much. We're going to be more austere. We're going to, cut down on government waste like Elon Musk is, and we're not going to allow all this immigration. The problem is that GDP stuff matters, right? You might think that the immigration story is more important, or that the government solvency and financial crises of the government is more important. But GDP growth matters a lot. There's a reason why governments were so obsessed with GDP growth that they were happy to ruin their reputation when it comes to immigration and financial matters. And so my worry is we're swinging back too far the other way. We're going to end up with a prolonged period of very low or no economic growth, potentially even recessions per capita, which is playing out in many countries around the world right now. And it's going to be on the back of this focus on immigration policy and fiscal policy, cutting back on fiscal policy, instead of thinking about how to grow GDP. And people are going to get a nasty reminder why GDP growth does actually matter so much and why we were fooled into focusing too much on immigration for the last few years, too much on GDP for the last few years.
So, is it the case then? Because I can see about spending more money than we have, how that's an issue. But is it the case that if you have more immigration, you automatically have a higher gross domestic product, GDP? Is that how it's calculated, sort of per head of population?
Well, that's the distinction is whether it's per head or whether it's total. So if you think about the pie, the more people, the bigger the pie, simply because people spend money, right? And there's an interesting confusion then when you say, well, per person, that doesn't necessarily mean that that per person slice of the pie is growing. So you can have a pie that's getting bigger and bigger, but it is because you're adding more people. And so actually each person's slice is getting smaller and smaller, even while the pie is growing. Now, politics is obsessed with the size of the pie. It tends to not mention so much whether the per capita, whether the slice is growing. And so what's happened, for example, in the UK and Australia recently is we've had recessions on a per capita basis. So each person's slice is shrinking, even as the pie is growing. GDP is still growing. In the UK, on and off. In Australia, it is still growing. So people tend to vote based on their personal experience, not GDP statistics. So they feel like they're getting gaslit, right? Their slice is shrinking. They can feel their slice shrinking, but the politicians and the statistics agencies are telling them, "Ah, don't worry, the pie's growing, the pie's growing," and so that divergence is causing a lot of angst and anger. But nevertheless, you need to. But there is one crucial reason why the pie needs to continue growing. Um, it's basically debt. So your debt figure, your national debt, depends on how large your pie is. If your pie is shrinking, that makes it really difficult to repay the national debt. A bigger pie makes it easy to repay the national debt over time because the economy is growing, outgrowing the debt. Um, the confusion comes from the fact that immigration as a tool can shrink the slice of the pie while growing the overall pie. And so it becomes more of a trade-off between the two. The worry is that because of demographics over the next few decades, the pie is going to start shrinking unless you have loads of immigration just because of the number of people. And so if your pie is shrinking, but your national debt stays, even if it stays the same, then that becomes dangerous over time, and hence the focus on immigration.
So immigration's also helpful for paying the state pension. And you're talking about demographics. In the West, we are aging populations. So we've got more and more people depending on the state or going to be depending on the state. And it seems fewer and fewer to pay into the state in order to pay that. Is that one of the big issues that we're going to be having to face going forward?
Yeah, although, I mean, it's a temporary boost, right? It's easy to understand how that every immigrant now will eventually retire. The confusing part in all of this is that it's not just about the ratio of the population to old people, to pensioners, to age pensioners. It's also a question of how many children, because children are sort of a dead weight on the economy as well, right? They cost us money, and they don't do much. They're not very productive. And so we have had less and less children and more elderly as a proportion of the population. So I'm not sure how the two sort of cancel each other out, where the net effect is. And I've been trying to find this in some research actually to try and get someone to calculate, well, we've got way more old people as a proportion of the population now, which is a problem. But we've also got a lot less kids, which is theoretically, at least in the short run, good news because it costs us less in terms of education and healthcare and whatever else. Well, what's the relationship between the two? How do they tune that out? Are we actually saving money by having this demographic shift because we have less young people to take care of, or are we ending up with the bill for old people outweighing that? And I can't find any results. I can't find any sort of estimates of how the two net out. Eventually, though, it's going to be a problem because of this overall pie shrinking relative to the national debt. That is the key reason. If we didn't have, think about it this way, if we didn't have any national debt, right? A shrinking pie wouldn't be a problem as long as each person's slice is growing.
Mm-hmm.
This is sort of what's happened in Japan to some extent, except that they do have the national debt problem. So there's lots of terrible statistics about the Japanese economy. Well, on a per person basis, it's actually been performing quite well, especially once you adjust for the cost of living, right? And that's not really spoken about very much. Eventually, the Japanese will get into trouble because of their national debt. But if they didn't have that, then you could actually point to Japan and say, look, their economy shrunk, but they've grown wealthier on a per person basis. And this is actually the model that Westerners should be following. They should be saying, look, let's give up on trying to grow the economy as a whole. Let's focus on growing each slice
Mm.
of each person's slice. And if we didn't have this massive national debt burden to deal with, we could do that. And so that implies that in the future, we are going to have some sort of a debt crisis at some point because immigration is only a short-term solution. But after we have that debt crisis, it's at least possible that we might get into some sort of sustainable path where actually we give up on trying to grow the economy as a whole and we continue to grow wealthier despite that. And people and economists and politicians start to understand this distinction between the overall pie and the size of each person's slice.
So when I'm looking at various figures and I get sort of graphs showing how many people are, or percentage of people in this country, well, let's just have a look at the UK, are taking from the system and those that are giving. I'm seeing, for example, that 52% of our population in some way is taking from the government system and 48% are actually sort of paying in. So that looks to me to be completely unsustainable. And I'm thinking maybe we have to wait until this debt crisis or some other financial crisis for governments to be enabled, if you like, to make swinging cuts. Um, does this make sense to you?
Yeah, it's the same with all political sort of stories and campaigns. We look at net zero, right? There were lots of experts warning all along that this was not possible. This is going to cost too much. It's not physically possible. There's not enough resources. We're just going to end up moving our industries overseas. The total amount of pollution won't actually go down. All these things were explained and detailed and listed by experts. But it took these bill shocks and these, all sorts of net zero debacles to make people finally realize that, and that then the politics could change. We had Kemi Bay not say that net zero is impossible as the target currently stands. It'll be the same with these fiscal issues, and that's always been the case. Current countries have always gotten to the point where they can't continue to borrow anymore, and they do have some sort of crisis before things can change. That's what happened in the 70s in the UK. The question is how bad things have to get before people wake up. Do we have to go to Argentina or to Zimbabwe or to the UK in the 70s? How far do we need to get to be like Greece in 2010? Um, and the other question is who imposes that fiscal sanity or awakening or reckoning? The UK had the IMF do it. The Greeks had the Troika do it. The Germans had the inflation do it. The Argentines had a really weird mix. So there's a couple of different ways the reckoning and the pressure can be applied, and a couple of different extents to which it can get worse until. However, we've never had the demographic problem before in history. Uh, and so one of the challenges right now is that it was always only a matter of time before economic problems solved themselves by having a population pyramid, which would eventually grow the economy, meaning eventually the number of people in the economy would grow, and this would solve all the other problems. Our national debt would become small relative to the size of our economy, given enough time, just because the workforce was growing. That's not going to happen anymore. Workforce is going to shrink, which means we actually are going to have to solve the root causes of the problem for a sustainable amount of time in the future. We won't be able to just sort of fudge things until the economy naturally grows thanks to the amount of people in it growing. And so there's going to have to be some radically different shifts. And there's two schools of thought on this. One, which I'm in, says this means the government's going to have to get a lot smaller because it can't afford to be as big. And the other school of thought says, given how many people now rely on the state, how many people will be pensioners and so on and so forth, they'll just continue to vote themselves as many benefits as possible. And so we're on a path to very large government intervention, very large amounts of tax. I don't know which of the two it is. Maybe I'm just being optimistic when I say the government's going to be forced to shrink. Maybe we'll go along the opposite path for a while before having a bit of a reckoning. But
I
um,
suspect so. I mean, this is what I'm feeling, that we will go along the second path, as you say, because we've got so many people who will vote. I mean, I look at France, where they were last year, as you know, they tried to put some sort of sensible cuts into just really very small ones, actually, into the budget, and the whole government fell because of it. And I think we're probably going to go towards that across Europe, across the West, until suddenly it breaks because you can't tax people anymore. The taxable people will just leave, and everything will break down. That's my feeling.
yeah, and so again, what makes that in what you've said is not unique historically speaking. What makes it dangerous this time around is that a large number of countries are going into that at the same time. and also this demographic side that we spoke about before. So historically speaking, different countries at different times would try this economic experiment that we're sort of all going into right now of spending too much government control, too much government redistribution, too much taxes, and so on and so forth. And so people would just leave. They just go to other countries to where their labor is respected and whatever it is. This is why the EU's tax harmonization and legal harmonization is so important. It's because people can't escape anymore. So there's no competition between governments for sensible policy anymore. But people can still leave the EU, obviously. And so if a large chunk of the developed world's going into this crisis at the same time, that makes things a bit more interesting because people can't escape quite so easily. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to be treated much better?
Good point. So we might see uprisings. That would be an interesting thing, because if they can't leave, there's going to be it's going to be like a crucible, and suddenly there's going to be a bit of an explosion potentially.
I think it's more likely that it'll be more like the Ayn Rand novel where people just don't bother anymore. Um, Productive people that would have started businesses just don't bother anymore. Higher income earners just don't bother earning that much income anymore. You get more black market economies and growth in that sphere. That's happening with the cigarette story in Australia at the moment and also in the UK. I think we're more likely to see a lot of that over time than a big revolt. Because if there was a big revolt, it would be a democratic one, right? Well, you would expect to have a democratic one before. Now, I think it would be fair enough to point out that the democratic revolt's not going so well, especially in Europe, also in places like Brazil. They're having some legal issues at the moment. But nevertheless, you would think people would express their dissatisfaction at the ballot box before they revolt, or that they would simply sort of go quiet and disappear, and you'd have this "Who is John Galt?" Story. I wish they would revolt a bit more, but I think that makes, if you confront the system, it's almost provoking it, that it's just not the right way. I think the system's going to be pretty good at putting those people down, as it does many other cultural contexts. People who oppose too much immigration, for example, the system is very good at battling them, right?
Yeah.
So you'd hope it would be something more like Doge or the election of Trump. But the system, like you say, it's getting a lot of Democratic support.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I'm going to ask you finally the $65,000 question, which is how long do you think we've got for the rot to continue before something major happens? Is it going to happen this year, or will it be in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? Can you get your crystal ball out?
Yeah, there's still lots of things that can unfold in so many different ways that it's quite difficult to figure out. And people don't necessarily blame the right factors as things play out, right? So the response might be directed at foreign enemies or, historically speaking, when governments resorted to inflation to solve these sorts of problems, everyone's blamed everything apart from the government for the inflation. It's ridiculous to us in hindsight, but when you don't want to solve the problem because you're all living off the state, then of course you're not going to acknowledge the fact that it's too much government spending that's causing the inflation. Um, I think Japan must be getting close at the moment because they've got higher interest rates now. And I think the world, if we remove the but look at Japan excuse of governments that are spending too much and borrowing too much, that could start to matter a lot. But I mean, back to your point, the people will eventually revolt. Well, people have to ask themselves, what will it take for them to revolt, to stop paying taxes properly, to start participating in the black market or the grey economy or whatever it's called. And that's probably the point at which things start to break. And I think that's quite a way off still. I think you can sort of sap the spirit out of people for a very long time. Argentina certainly did. That revolt in Argentina with Javier Milei, that didn't come out of nowhere. That was quite a long, slow process. And it was actually that those reforms were attempted several times. But the backlash politically happened several times as well. So, maybe we even need several revolts before all of this unravels properly.
Finally, having said finally, what should investors do? Is it basically gold, Bitcoin? Is it, that we need to be in the defensive investments, defensive stocks, if there are any? What should the average investor do to protect himself and herself?
I think they've got to be ready for governments to impose very arbitrary policies on whatever investments they make. Things like gold confiscation or making Bitcoin illegal or imposing wealth taxes or gating pensions. We're seeing at the moment with the Labour government and also in Europe questions about directing pension fund spending into things the government believes, which is really interesting because the government could just spend the money itself, right? It could just fund its own defense spending, but it's saying, no, we should have investors move some of their pension funds into these defense companies, or it's saying, pension funds should fund these infrastructure projects. Well, why not just have the government do it? So I think there's going to be sort of more encroachment of the state in your investment decision making, in your returns, in ways that we're not used to, in ways that South African investors and Argentine investors and probably some other investors around the world are used to. So I would look at what and Greek investors are used to as well. We had the bank holidays and we had the confiscation and bank bail-ins in Greece. I met some Greeks who had some terrible stories about how their lives were impacted by the bank closures and the constraints on being able to move your money around the country. So perhaps think about it like this. Your ability to sort of battle against these sorts of arbitrary impositions of government policy might be what matters more than your investment success. So, for example, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies allow you to move your wealth around the world without needing to have recourse to legal systems or to banking systems and so on. That might be what makes it useful rather than the price gain of the cryptocurrency in the future. You might need to pay a bill in a foreign country and the government's stopping you from doing so because they've got foreign exchange controls on. Something crazy like that might happen. So the guy I met from Greece, I think he was in the US. He'd been given a scholarship and a university place at a top university there, but he was unable to pay his tuition fees because the Greek banking system was stopping it. So he wasn't able to take up his degree there. So he missed out on that education because of these arbitrary rules. So these sorts of odd things that you and I, as investors from developed countries, aren't used to dealing with, they might be what matters even more than your returns or capital preservation in the future. You might have the government saying, look, your money's safe in your pension fund, but you don't control it. You don't control what's invested in. You can't gain access to it. So is it really yours?
Good point. Nick, that's amazing. Thank you. You've given us so much to think about, as always. That was Nick Hubble, who's an investment writer and economics writer for Southbank Investments. So this has been the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I have been Jasmine Birtles. As I said at the start, follow us, subscribe, like, and do put comments in the comments section because we'd be very interested to hear what you think and what you're doing with your money. Join us again next week.